Welcome to devMode.fm, a podcast dedicated to the tools, techniques, and technologies used in modern web development. I'm Andrew Welch from NY Studio 107.
I'm Patrick Harrington from Mildly Geeky in Boston.
I'm Jennifer Blumberg from Next Solutions in New York.
And today we are talking to Sebastien Dehesdin.
You did
Sebastien Dehesdin from Bleeps and Blops. All right, say your name properly. This is a dumpster fire. Go ahead.
Sebastien Dehesdin.
It sounds so much better. And so thank you for coming on, Sebastien. I appreciate it. And we wanted to talk about the topic of luring clients away from WordPress. So, Sebastien, if you were off in the Genting Highlands in Malaysia hunting for Raffalsian flowers, and someone walked up next to you and said, hey, don't laugh. They're actually really cool. It's the largest flower in the world. They weigh 22 pounds. Okay. So you're hunting for these bad boys, and someone walks up next to you and says, I've been thinking about luring clients away from WordPress. How do you think we should do it?
I would say that, I guess I would ask them a few questions about why, like how they learn, web development, and maybe why they want to step away from.
No, man, we're hiking through the jungle. It's stressful. You got to give them like the quick answer. Like, yeah. How do we do this?
I would say that they should tell their clients that they're gonna enjoy working with their websites again, enjoy, opening the CMS and adding content. And I would also say that as a developer, you will also enjoy, coding more. And, for a number of reasons, you owe it to your clients and you also owe it to yourself.
So, yeah, you aptly point out that there are two forks of this, right? So one is the developer experience and the other is the user experience. And I feel like we have to sell the first one or the second one first, right? Because we don't get the nice developer experience unless we're actually able to convince people to switch over to this weird thing called Craft that they've never heard of. Whereas, all of their friends use WordPress. I mean, any of you folks have strategies for tackling that?
I would say, for me, the backend experience is the main selling point, because often clients who have used WordPress are super frustrated. And, if you mention the word WordPress, they're like, oh, yeah, we have used it. Okay, I guess, if we have to, it's fine. And especially since one of the recent upgrades where the editor changed,
right.
it broke a few things. And depending how many websites they've used, some of them may have like a builder, some kind of virtual composer, whatever it's called. And those are super, super annoying to use. And so I think if you just show them the interface of the Craft admin on like a couple of your sites, that's the main thing. And just, tell them, go on, add some content. And I think that goes a long way.
Jennifer, what do you do to like lure people in to say, hey, check this out? I know WordPress is like the thing that and I know there's some comfort in that, but take a look at this. And what do you do to make that happen?
Yeah, usually the first thing I talk about is the money, because that really that sells it to them much quicker than other things, which I think we should probably get into later, since now we're talking about author experience. But the crux of the money thing is, this will save you tons of money depending on how much customization they need, and that usually does the trick. But going back to the author experience, I have a few clients who've been used to Visual Composer and those other page builders, and they all find them annoying. But Craft doesn't have that out of the box. If you want to create a flexible content builder, it'll be pretty easy to do with even just a simple matrix. You can go and build that, but it's not plug and play in the way that WordPress kind of is. So it's something that if you have an example of a simple website, even just using Craft's Happy Logger sort of boilerplate/demo, you can show them a live preview of, moving content blocks around, then that will probably do the trick as well.
I've got one that I use, but I'm going to give Patrick a chance just to see if that's, I want to give him the first shot at it. So Patrick, what do you use because let's be honest, like there are a decent number of clients that they will rely on us for our technical expertise, and they'll just, take whatever we say you should be using. But there are other clients that we have to spend some time kind of massaging them and convincing them to use this thing called Craft or whatever else, if we're using Gatsby or some other. Doesn't matter what it is, some platform that is not what they're familiar with. How do you approach that?
Yeah,
Patrick?
My biggest thing first is to really don't go in there trying to sell them on a specific technology because you understand before they've gotten to that understanding that craft is the way they should be going. I find trying to find out what's their pain, what are they dealing with, really getting into that. And, no one wants to go into a car dealership that maybe has like Toyotas and Lexus, like I really want a Camry. And the next thing you know, the car salesman is showing you nothing but Lexuses. Yeah. And you're like, no, like I came in asking you for a Camry. Why are you showing me a Lexus? Like, are you just, is this all you can do? Can you not actually sell me the Camry? Like I feel like people smell that and
you feel like you're not being listened to.
Yeah. Or just that, okay, this person puts everyone on this system. They're not trying to understand why I like WordPress, or maybe why I do have some pain with WordPress, but I'm hoping you can fix it. And maybe it's not fixable, and we can then educate you on why craft is the better option. I think you always, I'd be very careful going into, if anyone, let's say they're on WordPress today, if they're looking to get away from it, then that helps that a whole lot. And you can very quickly start talking about how the content is set up, plugins and vulnerabilities there, which I'm sure we'll get into. But I think the biggest part is getting really deep into an understanding of what are their difficulties, what are they trying to achieve. They may be perfectly fine with WordPress, in which case that's not a terrible thing. You can advance custom fields and all that, try, maybe keep them on WordPress. You may lose that client or not win the sale if you really try to fight them on WordPress. And I think you need to know when that's the case. But I think, getting to the root cause of why they're doing this website upgrade or website overhaul or whatever it might be is key to any sales process.
I think you kind of nailed something there, which is that don't go into it immediately trying to convince them to use X, right? Yeah. It's almost like it's almost as denigrating as just generic like pickup lines at a bar. You know what I mean? Like it's like an eye roll. It's like, oh, really? How long did you spend, thinking of that one, right? Yep. What really, if you really want to make some kind of a connection with your client, is you have to sit down and you have to listen to what they're trying to accomplish, what their business goals are, and then what you can do is you can tailor what you're going to show them around what they're telling you that they have problems with or issues with or are trying to accomplish, and then you end up with something that they really do feel like they're being listened to because you are showing something that addresses their needs and concerns. What do you think, Sebastian?
Yeah, totally agree. I think there's also something interesting is that the more features they need, the more of a case you're going to be able to make. So for example, if they want a multilingual website or if they want to manage, two websites from one admin, then I think the craft demo becomes extremely convincing. And potentially also it's the same with, the commerce plugin versus WooCommerce, although there is the license fee, which is a bit higher. So like that's a bit more of maybe a harder sell. But from experience from my clients, it's a lot of portfolio websites. So it's just, box standard content, adding images and things like that. And I think for that, you do have to tailor it a little bit, but it's almost always the same sort of sell, I find. But for I guess for an e-commerce, it would be a very different conversation. But for portfolio sites, I feel like you can kind of, reuse the same demo.
So I'm just going to go for it. Since none of you bit into it, I'm just going to take it. So One of the things that I show people or clients that they just absolutely love is live preview. You get in there and you say, and you show them you're editing the stuff and they're like, oh, that looks nice. And oh, you can do this. And then you hit the live preview, right? And they're like, whoa, that's really cool. I can see exactly what and it's that they get that kind of nice reassurance, right? Because they're not the ones that are designing the HTML and the CSS and all that kind of stuff. So they have no concept of what this is going to look like when it's actually on the page. And I think there's just something so reassuring about the live preview feature as a way, whether it's coming from WordPress or whatever, just as a way to get them involved. Have you run into that, Jen?
Yeah, definitely. I think clients love the look of live preview, and I think you're right that they feel reassured, especially coming from those page builders where they can sort of see what the page is supposed to look like, and then they sort of publish it and say, oh no, this button isn't lined up, and how do I line up the button? And maybe they'll need to call the developer team, i.e. us, and we'll say, oh man, well, we'd love to line up that button, but WordPress has injected in, 20 million lines of JavaScript, so we can't really line it up that easily, and it becomes a whole production. Whereas craft, obviously you need to have good HTML, and that's not, always guaranteed, but if you're responsible for it, you know that it's your HTML and things will align if you make it. And there isn't a sort of behemoth of a framework that's going to mess it up, which I think WordPress sometimes does.
And it's funny, I've had a remarkable amount of success. Just like showing live preview can show people how great the content experience is. When we think about content, showing people what is actually happening under the hood with a tool like Visual Composer or WP Bakery or whatever that monstrosity is called, showing them the tag soup that gets, like I've literally said, do you see how this content is in structured? And they're like, yeah, it's great. We can just drag and drop. I'm like, look what it looks like under the hood. And they're like, oh, yeah. Any upgrade you want to do is going to be really difficult because everything is just souped together and tied into how it looks. You're not just thinking about your content. This is going to make even a small redesign on your theme on WordPress really difficult. And we can keep going this way, but you're going to have to keep on fighting against this blob of goo. While, again, if they want to stay in WordPress, ACF at least cleans things up a little bit. It adds some structure, but Craft just does things in a so much better way with the way it breaks things out into these things called fields. And it's.
I love that you're calling it a glob of goo because and I get heat for this, but I don't care. I'm going to do it anyway.
Here we go.
One of the things that I've said for a long time is that WordPress is kind of the chicken McNugget of the CMS industry in that it's like this indefinable chicken paste that's kind of like just stamped together and then deep fried. You know what I mean? And that anyone can then cook it, but it doesn't mean that it's going to be all that healthy for you.
Yeah. And I mean, with Gutenberg, I think we talked about this in a prior podcast, but they're actually using HTML comments to build out the structure of these Gutenberg blocks. I didn't believe you.
You told me that. You told me that, and I didn't believe you. I'm like, there's no way it could be that bad. And then I looked at it. I'm like, holy shit.
Yeah. I mean, at 26, 27-year-old, whatever technology, that it was never meant to be used for any sort of semantic structuring, and site building is now just being jacked onto. Yeah, I feel like that's going to come back and bite them in someday, but we'll see. Yeah.
I think it's already biting them. I mean, they have lost a lot of happy customers by sort of publishing something live that, perhaps, they do have quite extensive argumentation on behalf of why they did it, but a lot of people were saying, well, don't force people to use it, make it a plugin, because there have definitely been clients that have been upset with it. I mean, one, for accessibility reasons, and two, it's making their publishing experience less seamless when we should be striving for the opposite. So, in framing everything, as Sebastien mentioned, in terms of what's in it for the client and their experience, I mean, you can point to WordPress in that case going backwards, and Craft probably, I think, going forwards.
Yeah, it's funny if you look at the plugins, the plugin like store in WordPress, and you look for the classic editor, and it's got like millions of installs, and it sort of tells you, the first thing people do is just revert to the old editor. Also, I think something interesting is, things like Squarespace and Wix and this kind of sites, they've massively improved in the last few years, and it actually makes more sense now if a client wants, this kind of interface and maybe doesn't have a huge budget, to redirect them to one of those and say, look, actually this is fairly decent now, and it might fill your needs, and more than WordPress. They're definitely losing the edge a little bit.
So that's an interesting point that I would like to hear people weigh in on here, is that with Gutenberg, which is relatively new, so one of the things about WordPress is that people know it and they're comfortable with it. Adding Gutenberg to the mix, now that comfort level, at least to some extent, is gone. Do we have an opportunity here where people are then saying, oh, okay, well, if I'm going to have to learn something new, I'm more open to looking around at other potential possibilities? Has anyone noticed that?
Not massively, because you can just revert to the old editor. So you can't really hide, you can't really hide that from them. I suppose.
It's hard to say. I think it's still new, and people don't update their sites all the time or do a website overhaul all the time. But I have felt like in the last 3 to 4 years that WordPress has lost some of its shine. Selling Craft 6 years ago when it was brand new is very different from today. I think people are much more open to hearing about other things. And I think something like Gutenberg only makes that conversation easier. I mean, Andrew, you've said it before that when things are in a time of transition, that can be very lucrative. That can be a big opportunity.
Yeah.
And I think we're going to see it. WordPress has made a push towards Gutenberg and just baking everything into an HTML blob. Meanwhile, Craft is making a move towards GraphQL and getting into, we can still do all the templating, everything for you. We can also do cutting edge GraphQL delivery of your content, and you can go headless. And I've had clients just in the last 6 months ask about doing headless e-commerce, and that's starting to get out there just because of the speed benefits and the CDN abilities that come with it. I think that helps sell people too, to really see the direction that the systems are taking and who is kind of up on where skate to where the puck is going.
Now, to that point though, WordPress has a GraphQL plugin that you can use, right? I haven't used it, but I know it exists, and it's something that you can use and you can plug into, and there's a Gatsby starter for using WordPress. Is it possible that some of this Jamstacky type of stuff and tools like Gatsby are going to pave over some of the stuff that developers hate about WordPress? And now as a developer, we can just be like, okay, I think WordPress is atrocious, but it's fine. Now I just have an API and I don't have to worry about it.
But I think even the WordPress API is, lacking in many places. I have one client. They're very, very technically proficient. They're actually a big tech company. And the first thing that they said, they actually have a couple of WordPress sites, and they said, we need to disable the REST API because it's a security hazard. And it actually happened that one of the sites was hacked through the REST API. Yeah. So it kind of seems like putting a bunch of Band-Aids on something that's sort of fundamentally flawed, when you should, if you're really going to go headless with WordPress, like, why would you? Why would you not go headless? I mean, presumably only experienced developers would even start doing something like that. So if you're going to do that, right, then do it with anything else. Rather than WordPress.
Even then, there is the WordPress GraphQL plugin, but then on top of that, you need an additional plugin to then open up Gutenberg or use a flag in Gatsby to recognize ACF fields. At the end of the day, there's still a foundation there that is very, very simple, which is we have a post, and here's the post body, and here's some post meta. It's so flat that I think building larger and more complicated websites and content models, which is what the web is requiring these days, it is really becoming a pretty top-heavy thing for them. Until they someday have some major WordPress breaking change that starts to take things out of that old system, I think they're always going to have a tough time adjusting and not having to resort to these big, heavy plugins, because otherwise they'd have to do some pretty large breaking changes that would disrupt things quite a bit.
Yeah, I think WordPress sites are kind of like crazy relatives. Like, we all have one somewhere, right? One or two, or
that we're kind of embarrassed about, but we
yeah, oh yeah, this is mine, by the way. And
why
so
I'm not on Facebook anymore. Yep.
So for full disclosure, I've made fun of another host here, Jonathan, because until recently his corporate site was done in WordPress, even though he does nothing but high-end craft sites, which I thought was hilarious. But in full disclosure, I have a WordPress site that I continue to use and maintain. That is my private shame that I am sharing with all of you. Okay. But I think it's interesting, right? So, okay, great. We can get this GraphQL plugin that we can use. But then I think one of the biggest virtues and one of the things that is a reason why a lot of people use WordPress is not just momentum, not just that everyone I know uses it, it's a standard type of thing. It's also that a relatively inexperienced person can actually build a site, right? You can fire up WordPress, you can install a theme, you can install some plugins, and I'm not saying it's going to be good, but you can, as a not really that technical person, you can get a site up and running. But if we do start doing stuff where we run WordPress headless and we then are, using something like Gatsby to actually build what's deployed, you're removing that power, right? It's no longer something that just a person can slap together. You need a developer involved. And I think that may be an opportunity too. It's great that all this data is in WordPress and you can get it out via GraphQL. But if I'm going to need to hire a developer anyway, maybe I can look around,
Yeah, if they're at that point where they're going to have to hire a developer, maybe for the initial site build as well as ongoing, I personally would, try to educate them on the long-term security risks of WordPress, all of those things that come with it. If they are not the type that needs a developer, then to me, even then, WordPress, given the security issues with it, something like Squarespace or Webflow or any of these other, kind of ready-to-go systems, you could have a small consulting engagement where you educate them on how to build something in it, get it up and running for them, and actually make that pretty pretty lucrative over, just a handful of days. And they come off and they feel great about it. They control their own destiny with that stuff. And they're probably going to recommend you for other ones where rather than going through even a craft build on what might not really need the power of craft, it may not always be the right fit for that client. Yeah.
And I love the fact, Patrick, that I've gotten you from rolling your eyes whenever I mention Webflow to actually now you're the one pimping it. Okay.
It's nice. Yeah. I wish it. Yeah. I wish the editing worked on my iPad Pro, but.
But I want to get back to Sebastien on this. So one of the things that I don't know if this is an issue in discussing stuff with your clients, but is the cost of Craft CMS in terms of like the licensing fee? Because let's be realistic about it. Like we in the business know that there's a difference between price and cost. Right. So something could be free, but still have a very high cost associated with it. But have you had anyone balk it? Because WordPress, like I've heard people say, "Oh, well, I'm not going to bother with that craft thing. I don't want to pay $199 for it. I can just download WordPress." Have you run into that at all?
Yeah, I think it's more the way when I started introducing craft to existing clients and new clients, at the beginning, I was like, oh, and by the way, it has a license cost, but it's much better, blah, blah, blah. And it wasn't really, it was just sort of darkening the conversation a little bit. So now what I do to kind of avoid that is to absorb the cost in my costing.
Yep.
And and then I will sort of mention the license as included. So in my say itemized quote, it will say craft license included. And then hopefully if I take care of the hosting and the maintenance as well, then I add another line in there that says renewal license renewals for craft and plugins included. And so they don't really even have to know about it if they don't want to.
Right.
It only gets maybe a bit tricky if you're not the one who's doing the hosting and maintenance, because then if they have an internal team, and so you have to go into this conversation saying, okay, so look, there is the initial cost is included, but then you're going to have to pay $59 per year. But then I don't know, by that point, if they have an internal IT team and if they host themselves, then $59 per year and, a couple of plugins isn't going to scare them, I don't think.
Yeah.
So,
and you can count it as total cost of ownership as opposed to, just what really matters. I mean, it's amazing to me that some people, it's a psychology thing though, that some people will balk at a $199 price tag on a project that you've quoted out for $25,000. You're just like, what? Like, how do you handle that?
I mean, it's the line item. I've, bought a $30,000 car, but then spent time haggling over the $500 dock fee on the, I don't know why I keep going to car dealerships today, but I mean, to me, when I was starting out, I was especially always just absorbing the price of it because I just didn't want that to be something that threw off several thousand or, into the $10,000 projects. I didn't want us to have a hang up on $299. Like, I'm interested as I say this. The only thing that is always a little bit of a pain is the idea that, now it's, especially now that it's a license that should be renewed every year. How do you get that out of your name and not have to do the whole dance of, transferring the license to a new craft ID? Would love to know if you can pay for something, but put it under a client's email address so that ongoing it's up to them, but they already have a login. I feel like that should be easy enough to do, but I've never done it. To me, I think unless you're like subcontracting or something, if it's a good enough project size, I often will eat the price of it if I feel that that's something that might be a sticking point.
Yeah. So, I mean, the reason I bring this up also is that in the beginning, Jennifer, you mentioned that price is your number one lead in. So why and how? Like, what do you mean?
Definitely.
WordPress is free. How is price your lead in here? I don't understand.
That's a great question. So Craft CMS is not free, right? It's $2.99, I guess, for the first license, and then $59 a year after that. But as you mentioned, Andrew, you said, there's a difference between price and cost, and we need to think about the true cost. So $2.99, I calculate that as 2 to 3 hours of developers' time, and how much time does a developer spend hacking at WordPress to get it to do what you want? I mean, even installing WordPress, I spend several hours removing things that I don't want from it, and putting things that I do want. I rarely do this anymore because I don't do WordPress unless I absolutely have to. But I'll use something like Bedrock, which is a boilerplate that, incorporates sort of modern web development practices like, logical folder structure and, incorporation of things like Composer and things like that. And then I'll put in Timber to use Twig templates. And by the time I get WordPress looking, somewhat reasonable, I've spent a day, and that's the license fee right there. Not even getting into how long it takes to do customizations. So I've done this on multiple occasions. I'll take their specs that we put together and I'll model out, well, if we do this on Craft CMS as well as on top of Yi, if we need something more custom, it'll take, a month. And if we have to do this on WordPress, it'll take 3 months, and that sells them on it right there. Because you got building a house with some really great tools, or you're building a house by bashing rocks together. Like it's the difference is so obvious. It's never been an issue.
And also building something with WordPress is kind of like getting a huge slab of granite. Like you get here's everything, and then you have to take an air hammer to it just to jackhammer away and get rid of all the crap that you don't want, right? Whereas with Craft, it's like you have some clay and you just kind of sculpted it into exactly what you need it to be. And they kind of get that analogy immediately. But I want to get back to what you're talking about in terms of cost, Jen. So what you're saying is that you just show them that the amount of work it's going to take to hammer WordPress into something usable for them is significantly less than the amount of work that it's going to take to use a tool like Craft to build up a bespoke example of what they actually want. Building up instead of whittling down, essentially, right?
Yeah, and that's right. And that's why it's sort of almost irrelevant to talk about the license cost, because, and I think Sebastien mentioned this too, that we want projects that are sort of big ticket projects. I don't think we're talking about a $500 project, in which case the license fee will be a huge issue. But
don't use Craft. If it's a $500 project, you're irresponsible if you're using something like Craft. I'm sorry.
And if that's the case, it's probably, a Squarespace or Webflow or Wix type of thing anyway. I can't think of any, I can't think of any situation in which you should use WordPress. And I feel like I'm really bashing WordPress now. And I also have WordPress sites, and I've spent many years working on it happily. It's just, sort of in the last few years when I've sort of, it's lost its shine, as Patrick mentioned. But I think the cost thing, the license cost for Craft has never been an issue for any of our clients. I can say that. And we usually will just absorb it, and it pays for itself in an hour or two of work.
Yeah. I think the mentality of anything but WordPress is, I'm like, I don't know, we're kindred spirits on that regard.
I think that calls for a t-shirt. Yeah.
Yeah. Anything but WordPress. Who can do a good logo? Sebastien, can you do a good logo?
Not really, but we can find someone for $5, sadly. I've come across an interesting use case, actually. So it was potential clients, but it was like a friend of a friend. So, there wasn't a massive sort of, he was pretty open with me, and he had an online magazine that was running on Expression Engine with lots of content, and it sort of didn't have that much money, came to me for a quote, and I said, and he sort of, wanted to move away from Expression Engine to go to WordPress. And I said, look, this kind of site, lots of content, you really want to get onto Craft. And I tried to make the case for it and, quoted something. And in the end, he went with an agency that was based in Eastern Europe. So, which was obviously cheaper. And they only knew WordPress. So he was like,
sure,
look, my budget is this. I'm not going to find anyone, I know you, but you're not doing it. I'm not going to find anyone here in England who will do it for that price, and so I have to go somewhere else, and those guys only know WordPress, so I'm stuck with WordPress. And so they moved this whole site to WordPress, and it was a bit heartbreaking to see, but I thought that was an interesting sort of, I could see where he was coming from, and I couldn't really convince him not to, because he had to move away, and that's only the money he had, and so that was it, really.
Sure.
And for this,
and how did it go? Do we have any idea how it went? Did WordPress actually end up doing a decent job with it?
I think WordPress was okay with it, but the developers weren't that amazing. So now there's a few issues on the side that he's, sort of asking me to fix.
Wait a minute. Hold on. Sebastien, are you telling me that you get what you pay for? Is that what you're telling me?
Yeah, that's what I was getting at as the moral of the story.
And there is, man. There really is. Like there's price and there's cost.
Yeah.
You buy something super cheap, but you got to replace it every year. That costs you a lot of money.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Not to mention ending up in a landfill. Oh my God. I just got a mental image of this virtual landfill of all the WordPress sites that have been hacked. Oh my God. Oh my goodness. So Jennifer, you mentioned that try to avoid using WordPress if you possibly can.
Yes.
Do you actually turn down projects?
Yes.
If it ends up being that? Yeah.
If anyone insists on using WordPress, I would say, well, this is probably not a good fit, and I'll refer them. I mean, I have people that I refer them to who will happily take it on, and so I think happiness is important. Like I don't want my team. I want my team to be happy. I want to be happy. So it's just not worth it. I mean, the cost is also, spiritual cost and happiness cost.
Oh my God, yes.
So absolutely not. But it hasn't been an issue. I found few people have actually insisted on WordPress. I mean, one client, the only reason he was still leaning towards WordPress rather than Craft is he was concerned about the longevity of Craft, since it's a new product. It's still relatively new.
Yeah.
And he's also aware of the fact that, web frameworks kind of pop up and sometimes disappear. And he just wanted his company's website to last for years. And we ended up having a call with Craft's marketing team. And I think it was Leah. She shared the growth and the roadmap for the next 5 years for Craft, as well as she also had a chart up her sleeve with the growth, Craft's growth numbers versus WordPress's drop-off numbers. And yeah.
Go Leah.
Yeah, it was great.
Nice.
And it also helped a little bit that the negative press around Gutenberg was happening around that time. And he said, I'll trust her. I'll trust you not to lead us astray. Like, let's move to Craft. And that I think was the last time it was even an issue to move off WordPress.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense to me.
On that point, I feel like there's a slightly perverse effect of the license cost, which maybe makes people think that it's going to be less durable than WordPress where it's free. Because they kind of think, oh, it's free, it's never going to disappear, It's everyone uses it, it's free. But they think, oh, $200, $300. Like, what is this? So there's a company behind it. What if they close shop? And I feel like they wouldn't, weirdly enough, even though you can say, well, look, there's a business model there. And, hopefully that's why it's going to.
But okay, Sebastian, that's a great point. Yeah. So pursuant to that, we recently saw another CMS called Expression Engine, right? Yeah. That recently went open source, and they were also bizarrely purchased by an AI content marketing whatever, so we're not even going to get into that, but they just recently went open source. Everyone here, if Craft CMS went completely open source, 100% free to just download and use it, would that make your pitch easier, do you think?
I think it
Patrick
would.
Bell?
Yeah, I mean, to me, I've talked about this before on the podcast. I find today the license, the cost is low enough that it's annoying for a lot of clients. I've had clients that actually look at the pricing in suspicion. They love it. They'd almost be more likely to go for Craft if it costs several $1,000s than if it costs
if it was like Sitecore or whatever.
Yeah, no, I mean Sitecore is $100,000 oftentimes, but even like a Kentico or something that's in that $5,000 to $10,000 range, there are clients out there when you get to the larger ones that they're like, wait a second, why is this only $299? Because that's to get back to the all right. So if this is a filet mignon, why are you pricing it like to go back to McDonald's like chicken nuggets? And I honestly, if it was free and we were able to point to a monetization policy or system around plugins, the partner network, enterprise support, I think that would make a lot of conversations easier because open source is understood to be a thing. I think Expression Engine, I don't know what the plan was there in terms of overall monetization.
Let's not try to read any plan into.
I guess AI scanning of something. I don't know. I don't get it. But
Hail Mary pass.
I think there's a lot of supporting revenue there for Pixel and Tonic that if someday they pull that trigger and go open source, that the plugin revenue can really jump off from there, and maybe the share of plugin revenue changes because there's such more volume.
Support, man. I mean, if they went this route, they would be making their money from support. They would have an enterprise class, and they recently introduced some new support options for people, right? But that is how they would make their money. It's how Automatic did it. That's how Acquia or whatever it was. I mean, that's how they make their money from this stuff.
I'd say, Acquia it's
and
just
services,
bundles of money for hosting. Yeah, it's services. Yeah,
and services. Yeah, right. And you just gave me nightmares that someone from McDonald's corporate is listening and they're going to come out with a McNeon. The McDonald's filet mignon.
I have to.
Good grief. How about you, Sebastien? If Craft CMS went totally open source software, how would that change the discussion for you? And would it be a positive change for you?
I don't think it would change that much for me. I don't know. If anything, it make me more suspicious and like more confident of the direction of where it was going. And I know you can have support on open source projects, but paying for a license, I had this issue, so some kind of issue with Craft CMS once, and I emailed the support team, and I was just sort of getting to know Craft, and I was like, I'm going to shoot them an email, but they probably won't reply. And then they did within the day, and I could solve my issue. And I was like, oh,
right.
I love paying for stuff, suddenly,
right.
you sort of realize what you're getting for, kind of thing. So yeah, I don't know it, because remember, there's also the, I know it's not open source, but there's the solo option. So say I have which is free. So say I have a designer friend who just wants to do his portfolio and it's going to be like 2 pages. Right. And I'm like, I mean, maybe the people from Pixel and Tonic will correct me, but I sort of tell them, look, I think this is fair use under the solo license, and I'll help you set it up, and then off you go. So right. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, and I think you just mentioned something interesting, which is that from my perspective, one of the reasons why I decided early on to devote a whole lot of my time to learning and getting good at this particular CMS is my confidence in the team. Like that is really what did it. Like my interactions with Brandon and Brad and some of the other people on the team, that is why I said, you know what, I think that I feel comfortable spending my time learning this thing. But let me get Jen in here. If Craft CMS was completely open source and the business model was not even a concern anymore, how would that change the conversation for you? And would that be a positive change for you?
I'm not sure that it would change the conversation with clients, because I think 300 is sort of, a rounding error on the general proposal. But for me, I think like Sebastien, I would be a little bit disappointed, because I feel like I like supporting a company that's doing an awesome product. I like the support that I get from them on a couple of occasions when things have gone wrong, maybe during an update, there's been a bug. The support has been incredible. They come back within a few hours even and provide support. If the same thing happens on an open source project, it's sort of hit or miss on whether you'll get support, and you end up having to sink a lot of time into solving it yourself.
Right.
So I like that aspect of the paid product. And likewise, I think the team is awesome. I've learned a ton just from reading through Craft code, and I want to support that. I feel like it's made me a better developer.
So as you folks hopefully know, I make a bunch of plugins for Craft, right? And the interesting thing about this is both for Pixel and Tonic and for me, like we're not really in the business of making products, at least in my opinion. We're in the support business. I mean, both you, Sebastien and Jen, kind of voiced this in that, one of the things that you found really comforting was that you got responses immediately and you got fixes immediately and all that kind of stuff. And I think the fact that there is someone there to answer you and support you and help you fix your problem and help you get your work going, I think is a huge reason why people get behind one particular tool or another. So I think we are kind of paying for the support. So what if instead of thinking about it as just a free open source project, if what ended up happening was you're still paying money to them, right? So you still, we definitely want the company that is creating this thing to be healthy, right? Instead of buying each individual license, you're paying a fee in order to receive support from them, right? So you still are going to be getting all of that stuff. At least from my perspective, that removes a concern that some potential clients have that I speak to. They do want that hit by a bus kind of thing, so that it's open source, nobody owns it. Yes, there are maintainers, but if someone's hit by a bus, like there are things that can be done, and this thing can live on for the rest of its life, whatever that ends up being. And I think that is a big concern for some organizations. For others, it just doesn't really matter. But then also there is a little bit of a resistance whenever there's like a fee involved in something. It's almost like a paywall on a news site. You know what I mean? Where you go there and it pops up and it says, oh, do you want to subscribe? And you're just like, no, thanks. I'll just hit the back button. There are 10 other sources that will give me the same info. I don't care. And I think it's kind of the same here in that regard, at least in my opinion. And then it removes, and this is a very minor part of it, but it removes an annoying and an awkward conversation that you then have to have with the developers. Kind of like what Patrick was saying in that, okay, here's the fee, and then I got to sign up their credit card to make sure this happens and that happens. And it's not a big deal, but it's just an annoyance. So I don't know. I mean, Sebastien and Jen, I get your points on this. I just sort of think about it from the point of view of we're changing that the money goes toward buying the quote unquote product to where the money goes to buying the support, which is really what we wanted anyway. What do you guys think about that?
So are you thinking of so it would be sort of a per developer fee sort of thing? No matter how many sites you build, you pay X amount per month to get support on any of those sites? Is that the kind of thing you're thinking? Or
there are lots of different models that could be used. It could be that. It could be, and there could be, for enterprise fees, there could be a massive fee that if you want a response in 30 minutes, here's the plan for you. And the wonderful thing about that is then the enterprises that really need and want that support, in a sense, they kind of subsidize everybody else that doesn't need all of that. But another model could also be, per site. If a question comes in, you need to have a valid support contract, or maintenance contract or whatever, like kind of like what we do with our clients when we have a maintenance retainer or something like that.
But that's kind of, in a sense, it's a bit of semantics, because if we're paying for, rather than paying for a license, we're paying for support. When I think about how to pass that cost on to clients, I think I would still just absorb it because I'm providing them support. And part of that is, I'm paying for Craft to, debug their core code. So from my perspective, I don't think it would matter that much to me. But I think the pricing right now seems pretty fair, at least to me. I'm not sure if, if people with many dozens of Craft sites are happy with it. I'm not sure, but it hasn't, $300 per site plus $60 per year, to me, seems totally reasonable. If it's paying for support, I would pay that. There is some limit, though. I don't know what that limit is to how much I would want to pay, but I think there's a lot of pricing models that we could throw out there, and we could figure that out. But from the client's perspective, I'm not sure if either of those would make a difference, but I don't have much experience with that, so I'm not sure.
It's interesting you use the word limit, because to me, I was an economics major and I think about incentives. Right now, you pay $299 and there is no disincentive to sending in poor Brad, 10 support tickets a week. And he looks bad if he doesn't respond to you. And very quickly you think, $299 divided by support ticket. And it then turns into how much money they're making per hour of Brad's time. Or, it's not Brad. He's, we've long past the days of it being all on Brad's back. And at the same time, there's an incentive for people to use a lot of support, and I think they go above and beyond, because I've seen it all the time, but there's almost a disincentive for Pixel and Tonic to want to do support at the current pricing model, because once they've made that sale, their margins are better if they never have to support it. And they do that right now by making a great product, but there's a disincentive they want to cut down the support. You'd have those two things reversed if it was some sort of paid support, and it might be on an ad hoc basis and maybe a subscription basis, where people would say, okay, I have this allotment of support hours I can use, or whether it's per site or across a number of sites, and they would then feel great about support tickets coming in, because that means that they're selling support. I think when the incentives align, that's going to be a good thing. We talked about Expression Engine. There are so many plugin developers, and I think, Andrew, you're not there, but you've seen it from your time in Expression Engine, where people had a good plugin business and then got crushed under support because they made a one-time, $49 sale, or if they were a really high-end plugin, $199 sale, but that then entitled people to support for the rest of their life. I think long-term, you don't see it, again, going back to buying a car, you don't buy it and get free service for the life of the car unless you have an obscenely expensive car. But even then, I don't think any of them have free service for the life of the car. At some point, I think that'll have to change one way or another, either leaning more on community support or something like that. But right now, to me, the incentives don't line up.
Yeah, and we want Pixel and Tonic to succeed, right? We want them to do well. I want them to grow into a massive company. I really do want them to succeed.
Maybe not massive, but
Well, okay, let's leave it at we want them to succeed. Okay, is that fair?
Yeah.
But
massively successful, but hopefully still accessible.
Sure. Let's get Brad his private yacht that he can put his own, garden on top of the deck and all that kind of stuff. Let's do that, right? That's fine. But Jennifer, you mentioned semantics. And I think you're exactly right. It is semantics. So on the one case, we were saying, oh, you're paying for the product. I'm of the opinion that you've actually been paying for the support all along, right? It was just kind of a price tag was put on the product, but really what you're paying for is the support and the updates and all that kind of good stuff. So it really is semantics that we're then moving it over and saying, oh, you know what, that product that you thought you were buying, you actually were buying support all along. So we're going to move this over into the support category. And as Patrick said, make sure the incentives line up a little bit better. The thing that gives you, though, is that we do then have a free open source project that does allay those concerns for companies that are worried about the hit by the bus kind of scenario. And it does provide some level of comfort to people who are just like, oh, okay, I can just download this and start using it. And then once I get good enough and my business gets good enough, well, then I'll happily buy onto a support plan. You know what I mean? So that it may help grow the developer base as well. So couch that way, Sebastian, do you have any further thoughts on this, or you still are kind of not too sure about it going open source?
I'm not too sure because I've only had to, use the support like a handful of times.
Right.
And so if you suddenly said, again, like, like Jen said, if it's semantics, but if someone said, now you're paying for support, I'd be like, well, actually, I don't want support. So yeah, maybe I would, because then I guess I wouldn't have to buy it. But yeah, I don't know. I don't mind. Again, compared to the cost of the project, I don't mind. But if Pixel and Tonic, come out and they have a business case for their company that this is how they're going to reframe things from now on, then, I'd be happy to follow along for their sake, kind of thing. So yeah. Well, something else on support that Patrick mentioned is the community aspect, which is really strong with Craft as opposed to, I don't know, I guess many other online communities. I find it really helpful and non-toxic.
It'll get worse if it gets bigger.
Well, yeah. But I'm sure that sort of also alleviates support requests to their Pixel and Tonic team, because oftentimes someone.
But I think a lot of that, like, I'm going to give them full credit. Especially Brandon, that I think a lot of that is just that leadership comes from the top. And I think Brandon has made it very clear that is not the kind of community that it is going to be. So I will give them credit. I do think it's a great group of people, but I also think that Brandon has kind of established that this is the way that we're going to operate in this community. And I think that has a big impact on it, But Sebastian, one of the things that you mentioned is that you've run into situations where clients say, I've never even heard of Craft. I know a lot of other friends of mine that use WordPress. I know a lot of developers that use WordPress. How do you win that argument over?
It's hard because you don't want to criticize other developers too much, but I guess I would try and get a sense of whether they're happy with the other developers they've used in the past. And oftentimes they're not. It might not have anything to do with WordPress, but
true.
I guess you can start from there and say, look, this is the sort of the level of the quality that you get from Craft developers is much higher, and you can talk to them about the online community, the plugin devs, all this stuff, and maybe show them the Craft partners page and say, look, there's it's not just one person shops. There's also medium to big agencies who are doing it. You won't be left in the dark if I drop off the face of the earth. And yeah, I think it's hard. I think at that point, if they're not excited enough to go to Craft, then maybe you need to sell the product again. If that makes sense, because you kind of want them to be like, oh my God, yeah, I don't want to use WordPress anymore. This looks amazing. Just one thing, reassure me you're not the only one doing it. And then you're like, no, of course not. Look, I think in this dynamic, it works better than sort of them adding that as a negative point to a list of negative things. I think if they're not one at that point, it's tricky.
Yeah. So, I mean, another thing that I'm actually surprised hasn't come up yet is we are, as people, we are social animals, right? So just as an example, people tend to be happier if they don't compare themselves to other people, right? So they've done studies where people are demonstrably more happy about the amount of money they make as long as they don't know that their neighbor makes $20,000 more a year, So we have this weird thing where we are kind of dependent on other people for our cues. And one of the things that I have found that has been really useful in selling people on using Craft is, especially if they've never heard of it, if you can say, oh, well, so for instance, Moz.com uses Craft CMS. Is a huge selling point for anyone who has any kind of a background in digital marketing.
Yeah.
Another one would be, and this is a client that Jonathan and I have worked with, is we say, oh, the Barefoot Contessa, her website and e-commerce site is running Craft CMS. Like if you can point at them at brands and people that they know that they think are highly successful, they tend to think about it from the perspective of, oh, well, if they're using it, it actually, maybe it is really good. Have you run into that, Jennifer? You think that's a valid way to approach it?
Yes, definitely. It turned out that I think ProPublica or Publica, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, was one selling point for a client because they wanted to basically model their website after them. So they were really impressed by that. But yeah, definitely, it's always helpful to have big brands or sort of websites that people use regularly, be using this framework that you're trying to sell. It definitely can't hurt, and it almost always helps.
Patrick, you run into this? You do? Is this a tactic that you use?
I'm sorry, I'm on barefootcontessa.com, and there's this baked Alaska there that just looks tremendous.
Don't. I haven't even eaten lunch. Don't do this to me.
Yeah, I mean, I've gone between sites that I have done. One thing that always works well is just when people see that the site design looks different than your typical WordPress site, your typical Drupal site, whatever it might be, and they can see, really start to understand the way that Craft separates content from presentation. Yeah, I feel like we need a better list of kind of privately traded around large profile clients that are running on Craft. And of course, that changes over time. But yeah, absolutely, it definitely helps.
Because there's a marketing guy that I listen to. And one of the things that he said, and I get it, like marketing guys can be insufferable, but this guy in particular is kind of enjoyable. And one of the things that he says is we kind of have this mentality of people like us use tools like this. You know what I mean? And there is kind of that equivalency in terms of like, brands like us will use tools like this in order to sell our brand. And if you are, if like you're a local ballet studio or whatever, yeah, sure. I mean, use Squarespace or whatever. But if you're a brand that you really need to differentiate yourself and that extra 10% of customness or quality really makes a difference in terms of your competitiveness, then I think something like Craft CMS makes a heck of a lot of sense. And WordPress is kind of like a cookie cutter thing. And that's why they, at least in my opinion, that analogy of, fast food versus a fine dining experience, where if you say, I would like my meal prepared this way, they'll do it for you.
Yeah, that's a good point. I've actually used, I don't know if the old Happy Cog blog is still around since they merged with Vector, but I used to point people to different high-end agencies' blog posts where they talked about Craft and explained why they were moving to it, because then you can then take a step up from there and, okay, look, Happy Cog did Ben & Jerry's, they did all these other big brands. This is the technology they're looking to. What do you're using WordPress. What do you know that they don't? These guys know what they're doing.
Right. Yeah. And just that kind of, this is what this sounds terrible, but this is what the commoners use. You know what I mean? And this is a tool that if your brand really is that valuable and you are distinct, this is what you want. You want something custom because something custom helps you stand out from everyone else, and it helps you express what makes you unique. Sebastian, you're going to say something?
Yeah, I was going to say, I do wish there were more high-profile sites that were, that we knew were using Craft and that I could show, especially, in the UK or in France, in Europe.
It's funny. Yeah. Like a lot of them are, and I have like a secret inside track in that when I see plugin sales come in, I get the email address of whatever Craft ID it's associated with, right? So, okay, if it's associated with a development agency, then I have no idea, what it is being used for. But sometimes it's not, and it can be kind of useful. And whenever I see a name that looks kind of interesting, I go and check it out, and I'm like, oh, that's really cool. Yeah. So, like, this is not a high-profile one at all, but it was one that I kind of like. So, guidedogs.com, for instance. It's a craft site and it's really cool. And it's about service animals and it's just really cute and it's got dogs and what's not to love, But you're right. Seeing things like that, I think would be something really useful. And, we'll talk to Leah about it. Maybe she can put something like that together for us.
Yeah, there's a little bit of that on the support page where they're talking about Craft enterprise level support, where you see Nike, Mercedes, HP, a number of other. If you dig around on Craft, there's this Why Craft Your Organization, Sonos, Moz, PBS. There's a good bit there that can help, and obviously. People are going to say, well, which is the actual site? And you might not be able to point there. IDEO is a great one. Yeah.
It does get easier the more you develop, sites with Craft. Because you tend to, I don't know about you, but you tend to get clients similar to the ones you've had before. So if you've done a website for a hedge fund, you might get another hedge fund, and then you can make the case way easier because you're like, oh, look, your competitor, they're using Craft as well. And so it gets easier. And I suppose as the community increases, it's going to get easier for everyone. But
yeah, because again, brands like us use tools like this. You know what I mean? Like when people do see that happening, like it's a real thing. But that about wraps it up for another episode of the devMode.fm podcast. To have every episode delivered to your favorite podcast player, subscribe to our RSS or subscribe via iTunes or Google Play. And if you like what we're doing, leave us a review. You can also follow us on Twitter at devModeFM. And we'd love to hear your thoughts on this episode. Leave a comment on the devMode.fm website. For the devMode.fm podcast, I'm Andrew Welch.
I'm Patrick Harrington.
I'm Jen Bloomberg.
And Sebastian, thank you very much for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
So I'm not even kidding. The Raffalsian is a pretty wild flower. It's a 22-pound flower, and it smells like decaying flesh.
It looks it. I grabbed a link to Wikipedia, and I'm putting this one in the show notes.
Yeah. But that was. Jen, are you excited to go check it out now, Jennifer?
Yeah.
You want to wear one of those things as a corsage or something?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. I just love the sort of creative openings that you have. They kind of remind me of, I don't know if anyone watches The Late Show with Steve.